I'm under the impression that some of what I'm gonna say will seem kind of crazy, but maybe it won't. In a class like this, maybe I found my people. And of course, that's kind of the issue in a way, that I guess I wanted to try to talk about. It's difficult to talk about it because what I'm saying is really an expression of this pretty deep and profound ambivalence, which is to say that I really love the university, and then also at the same time I really hate the university. So I've been trying to figure out for a long time how to deal with this problem. And obviously part of the problem is precisely that we are often very much driven to believe that it's both possible and desirable to figure out problems such as this by ourselves. So I want to ask some questions, and they're genuine questions. I don't have the answers to them, but that emerged from the syllabus and from some of what y'all have been discussing already this year. And one question is it actually possible to decolonize the university? There's these phrases or slogans, mantra that we sometimes use. And the reason that they rise to the status of mantra or slogan is because they really sound good. And they sound good not just because we're silly. They sound good because they seem genuinely to be an expression of what it is that we desire. Okay? And one such phrase that I've found myself really attracted to over the last couple of years is the phrase decolonize this place. But it raises for me, after trying to think about it for a little while, the question of whether or not it's not just whether or not it's actually possible to decolonize this or any other place, but what if the very idea of place is inseparable from the theory and practice of settlement? Okay. Another question that I guess I've been interested in is what was the university? What has the university been that at one point it might have been considered a sanctuary? Okay. That paradox kind of emerges in really intense ways with this class, which I would imagine for you, like for many of you, like for me, this class actually constitutes something like a sanctuary. You can come here and think about things that maybe elsewhere you wouldn't be able to think about. And you can find other people to think about it with. This is a place where, for a little while at least, you don't have to feel so weird or so strange or so alone, right? And I think for many people, the university in general has been a sanctuary in this way, right? It's a kind of, sometimes it can feel like a safe space for nerds. And I'm, a nerd, I suppose you could say. And sometimes I've found the university to be such a safe space. Hence my love for it. But what I also know, and now to try to think about it specifically with regard to the American university, and perhaps more generally the North American university, is that, the invention, the discovery, if you will, of the modern world, the invention of this set of characteristics and set of conditions that we share under the rubric of modernity, they're grounded in a social and ecological disaster. And that disaster has a bunch of different characteristics and a bunch of different elements to it. But I think maybe the two most fundamental and defining elements are the transatlantic slave trade and what we now have come to describe as settler colonialism. It's a social disaster, and there's reasons why I think most of you know why that seems to me to be a trivial formulation at this point. It's obvious, right? The ecological disaster may be less so, but the conditions that have driven the degradation of our natural resources are totally themselves grounded in settler colonialism and the slave trade. These things are inseparable from one another. But what I want to also suggest to you today is that the modern university is part and parcel of that same structure and that same movement and that same development. So if the modern university or the modern American university is inseparable from the slave trade and from settler colonialism, and again, this seems trivial too, all the revelations, particularly in sort of rich Ivy League schools, Brown, Yale, Harvard, about the ways in which the financial grounding of that university is fundamentally tied to slavery and settlement, is just the outward proof of what is in fact sort of a deeply interior truth to the university, right? Not just in terms of how the university is financed, but also in terms of who the university is for and how the university works and the kinds of, okay. So here's where the ambivalence comes in. So I want to read two quotations, one of which is from a kind of intellectual hero of mine. And what's interesting about this quotation is from a text that was written over 50 years ago, is that in many ways he's raising the same questions that we're raising today in this class, that these are perennial questions, they've never disappeared. And I think he might have just as easily been reading text from 50 years before he published his text and seen some of the same issues. Imagine certain texts by Du Bois, for instance, that from the turn of the century that, and the person I'm going to read is Noam Chomsky, could have been referring to in 1967 as a preface to his work. But he wrote an essay in 1967 called The Responsibility of Intellectuals. And I just want to read one paragraph from it early on. He says, "It is the responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose lies. This, at least, may seem enough of a truism to pass over without comment. Not so, however. For the modern intellectual, it is not at all obvious. Thus we have Martin Heidegger writing in a pro-Hitler declaration of 1933 that, quote, truth is the revelation of that which makes a people certain, clear, and strong in its action and knowledge. It is only this kind of truth that one has a responsibility to speak. Americans tend to be more forthright. When Arthur Schlesinger was asked by the New York Times in November 1965 to explain the contradiction between his published account of the Bay of Pigs incident, do y'all know what the Bay of Pigs incident? Okay. And the story he had given the press at the time of the attack when he was a member of the Kennedy administration, he simply remarked that he had lied. And a few days later, he went on to compliment the Times for also having suppressed information on the planned invasion in the national interest, as this term was defined by the group of arrogant and deluded men of whom Schlesinger gives such a flattering portrait in his recent account of the Kennedy administration. It is of no particular interest that one man is quite happy to lie in behalf of a cause which he knows to be unjust. But it is significant that such events provoke so little response in the intellectual community. For example, no one has said that there is something strange in the offer of a major chair in the humanities to a historian who feels it to be his duty to persuade the world that an American-sponsored invasion of a nearby country is nothing of the sort. And what of the incredible sequence of lies on the part of our government and its spokesman concerning such matters as negotiations in Vietnam? The facts are known to all who care to know. The press, foreign and domestic, has presented documentation to refute each falsehood as it appears. But the power of the government's propaganda apparatus is such that the citizen who does not undertake a research project on the subject can hardly hope to confront government pronouncements with fact. One way to think about what he refers to in that last sentence as a research project on the subject is that that's what this class constitutes collectively, right? A research project, not just on the subject of sanctuary, but on the conditions that make right? The study of sanctuary necessary, the conditions that produce refugees, the conditions that produce the brutal formulations that correspond to these vicious and sclerotic notions of citizenship that we have to contend with constantly. Okay, so one way to think about the last 50 years, given, this again is from February of 1967, there's a couple of different ways that we can think about the last 50 years. And it turns out that maybe both of them are actually true, right? Which makes our task here a little more complicated. One is that the conditions that Chomsky describes have been greatly confronted and challenged by the transformation of the American university over those last 50 years, and in particular by the presence not only of, first of all, by the presence of a set of, of faculty and students who are committed to the challenging of these sort of national forms of orthodoxy, committed to the challenge what Martin Heidegger calls, all those revelations which make a people certain, clear, and strong in action and knowledge, right? We want to challenge those formulations. We want to fight against those formulations. We want to undermine everything that Heidegger thought he meant or even did that he actually meant under the rubric of the people, right? And so many of the ways in which the university has been transformed over the last 50 years has been a function of this constant injection of new forms of knowledge that constitute the ground for the challenging of those kinds of ideas, right? And they come under the rubric of women's studies, queer studies, ethnic studies, black studies, right? There's this way in which this eruption of something like a kind of radical refugee knowledge into the university has constituted the basis of its upliftment, we might even say, right? But we still have to ask two questions. One, what does it mean to have been assimilated into this machine? What are the effects on that knowledge that we revere when it is brought into a place like this, okay? In other words, what impact does this knowledge have? What impact is had on this knowledge by the place that it has been relegated to under the general rubric of a certain idea of sanctuary, okay? What is the status of the stuff that we know? You understand what I'm saying? And by that I mean, there's stuff we know. There's stuff we agree on, right? We know everybody should have something to eat, right? We know that the police shouldn't shoot people, okay? We know that making money is not more important than having fun, okay? So there's all this stuff we knew. It's not just that we know it, your grandparents knew it. Your crazy Uncle William knows it, right? Okay, your weird ass cousin who's never read anything, except comic books, he knows that, okay? We didn't come here to study that or to find that out. We brought that knowledge here with us. What happens to that knowledge when we bring it to a place like this? Okay, what's the impact of this mission that we have placed ourselves on, in other words, to transform and to uplift the university? Okay. How does it affect what it is that we already knew? Okay. And of course, the corollary question to that is how does it affect us? What do we become when we come to a place like this? Again, I'm not asking this question because I want everybody to just automatically say, fuck the university. Because as I told y'all in the beginning, I love the university, okay? I loved that the university was a place where I could go to find out that there was such a person as Noam Chomsky, or for that matter, Martin Heidegger, okay? I love that. I love that the university is a place where people like us can gather, particularly when it seems like maybe there's fewer and fewer places for people like us to gather. We come from a certain place and we love the places that we come from, but it's not like we all had easy, calm, naturally welcomed lives in those places that we left. They gave us something and we brought that stuff that they gave with us, but there was this other way in which we needed to go too, right? Okay. So that's one part of what I wanted to get at, or one way to set up a certain question, and here's the other. It's weird, Heidegger's the sort of linchpin for this, even though I'd never want to give him that much attention, but it's like playing with a stink bomb. But I wanted to read this other passage, and it's actually a passage from a text by Heidegger's teacher. Okay, the text that Chomsky's referring to, this 1933 speech that Heidegger gave, is this famous text of his called the Rectorate Address. He gave this address when he became rector of the University of Freiburg, okay, which was also his alma mater. And one of his teachers at Freiburg was a great German philosopher named Edmund Husserl. Okay, Husserl was actually his dissertation director. Husserl was a Jewish philosopher working in Germany, and by 1933, he was unable to even give speeches or talks in the German university as a function of the inception of the Nuremberg laws. Heidegger's great work is called Being and Time, and the original edition was dedicated to Edmund Husserl. The second editions that came out in the late 20s and early 30s, Husserl's name was stricken from that. The dedication was rescinded, okay? So one way to think about it is that Heidegger Heidegger disavowed his own teacher, okay? Or at least it appears to be that way. But I'm interested in this formulation that Husserl gives, in part because what I want us to do is to try to see if we can come to grips with how it is that a person who is committed to the human and to humanity, a person who is fighting against the grain of his own persecution and the persecution of others, might in a sort of complicated way maintain and even promulgate some of the fundamental structures of the very ideology that he's attempting to overturn or to undermine. Okay? And so remember, I'm thinking about the modern university within the context of a general formulation about modern life as having been grounded in settler colonialism and the slave trade. Okay? So here's this formulation that I found, and it's kind of interesting to me, at least. It's a formulation from a book of Husserl's, a really important philosophical work called Ideas. And it's this moment where Husserl begins to think about his own power as a philosopher. He's sort of in his stride at this moment. It's earlier at the turn of the 20th century, and he was really feeling that his work was moving well. He was feeling himself to be this fundamentally important and inextricable part of a long intellectual tradition that he, in a certain sense, wanted to imagine himself as the culmination of, right? Okay. And again, when I say this, I want you to remember or keep in mind how often the discourses of women's studies and ethnic studies and black studies and queer studies too can fold itself into this kind of thinking, right? That we enter into a way of thinking or a mode of thinking that we actually constitute the culmination of or the fulfillment of, right? Right? That there's something fundamentally wrong and exclusionary about these ideas, but if we come along, right, and insert ourselves in these intellectual traditions, we will somehow redeem them. We will somehow bring them to a kind of life that they never could have had except for our presence, okay? So here's this way that Husserl thinks about his own philosophical power, right? He says, I can see spread out before me the endlessly open plains of true philosophy, the promised land, though its thorough cultivation will come after me. And there's a philosopher named Marianne Sawicki who sort of gives a kind of commentary in terms of what it is that she thinks. And she writes this in a kind of unironic way. She's just trying to explain what it is that this guy means. She says, by means of this spatial geographical metaphor of crossing over into the new land, Husserl conveys something of the adventure and pioneer courage that should accompany phenomenological work. Okay. This science is related to a new field of experience that Husserl calls the field of transcendental subjectivity. It's like this thing that happens when at a certain moment you confront the fact that the most fundamental thing for a philosopher or for a thinker to learn or to think about is the structure and context of his own thinking, of his own thought. Okay? So one way to think about Husserl's philosophical work is that it attempts to construct, within the context of a tradition of philosophy that moves this way, it attempts to construct a situation in which the human thinker, right, is the convergence of subject and object, right? That who I am, what I really am, for me to come fully into my own as a person is the moment in which I enter into this pioneer spirit and try to understand what it is to be a person, okay? Where subject and object converge. It's not an accident that when Husserl gives this formulation, he talks about it from the position of like what Jonathan Edwards would call a city on the hill, right? It's a colonizing formulation. I see the open field before me, right? Okay. That's how philosophy shows up for him, okay? And so what I want to suggest is a couple of things. What if it turns out that the university is not just a kind of engine for colonization? We know that it is. We know that in the ways that it produces knowledge, in the ways that those forms of knowledge are devoted to the production of every brutal thing from new modes of financial instruments to new kinds of weapons. We know that the university is useful, brutally so, right, in producing the structures and apparatuses that go into colonization. Okay? It's one of the reasons why it's so hard to imagine how to decolonize this place. Okay? But what if it turns out that the university is also an engine for the production of settlers, right? Okay. Where what it is to be a settler is also just what it is to be a subject, okay? What it is to be an individual thinking person, okay? And most of us come to a place like this, or are sent to a place like this, deeply convinced in the absolute righteousness of the task of becoming a mature, thinking, individual, self-possessed subject. Right? That's our job. Our parents have been gearing us up for this forever, and they never stop. Okay? And that's what we're supposed to want to do. We valorize that condition. Okay? But what if, again, becoming a subject in that way is also in its own way an extension of settler colonialism. Okay? So this is why I got this love-hate relationship to the university. Okay? Sometimes I think, well, I can involve myself in this process of telling truth, exposing lies, cultivating myself, becoming a genuine, true, self-possessed thinking subject who can make rational, moral, and ethical decisions, who can discern beauty, right? And figure out all these beautiful ways to become enamored of and to be able to recognize what Kant calls, the awesomeness of the moral law within and the starry skies above. But how much of that ideology of self-cultivation is already bound up, right, with these very structures that we come together here in this class to try to do. I mean, I ask this question try to want to ask it in more fundamental ways, and I don't mean to speak out of turn, or I hope, the organizers of the class won't think I'm trying to cause any trouble. How much of the logic of the assignment, okay, of the individual paper, how much of that is already part of this cultivation of a kind of individual subjectivity that lends itself to settler colonialism? Okay. how much of the way in which we do our work, okay, is so bound up with this. And when I say we and our, I really truly mean it, because it's not like I'm outside of it. I'm not. I'm just trying to ask these questions from more or less the same position as you. Okay. I guess at the end of the day, I'm here to ask these questions with you because I can ask them with you. Again, the only thing that I have going for me today, the only thing that makes me standing in front of you even semi-legitimate, is that I don't know the answer to these questions. And that when I come here to speak with you, I'm asking these questions and hoping that you might think that these are questions that are worthwhile for you to ask as well. I think that to the extent that it might be possible to address these questions, which is a fundamentally different thing than answering them, that the possibility of addressing these questions has a lot to do with how we treat one another, how we actually relate to one another. That it might even be so fundamental that the way we think together and the way we are together and the way we share our thoughts together might even call the very idea of one and another into question itself. Okay, we'll see. But what I want to suggest is that if the university ever was a sanctuary, if it could ever be a sanctuary again, if it could actually be decolonized, that the way that we would go about trying to understand that or to enact that, to bring that into being, is that we'd have to really ask some fundamental questions about who we are and what we do together in this space. Okay. So one last thing. There's this guy, one of the architects of US Cold War policy was George Kennan. Okay. Just Google his evil ass and you'll see what I mean. But what was he wrote, it was interesting to find out that by 1968 and 69, many of the architects of US Cold War policy were deeply concerned with what was going on in American universities, right? Like they were really freaked out and scared. Okay. So it's interesting that people who 15 or 20 years later had been deeply and fundamentally concerned with how to contain communism, right? And who recognized, by the way, that the containment of communism didn't have nearly as much to do with fighting the Soviet Union as it had to do with jacking people up in Brazil and the Dominican Republic, right? Okay. That these same people were basically saying, you know, man, we got to figure out what's going on with the so-called student left, okay? So, interesting thing. Hannah Arendt, writing at much at the same time as George Kennan, she had a slightly different attitude about it. Kennan couldn't figure out why it is that students spent so much time caring about people other than themselves. He actually thought it was grotesque. Okay, he thought of it as a sign of moral and intellectual weakness. Okay, Arendt thought it was a sign of a kind of really intense and evolved sort of morality. Okay. She wanted to be, she felt that it was cause for a certain kind of exaltation, right? Okay. What I want us to do is to think really, 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 really clearly, if we can, even if he is an evil man, that there might be something right about George Kennan's formulation here. So that when I say that, and so one way to put it is, what's the condition of possibility of solidarity? Okay. How can you show solidarity with someone else? Okay. It's really important to pay some attention to the conditions under which you work and under which you live on a basic day-to-day level. Okay. I think that this is a fundamental question for sanctuary too. Okay. Right? It doesn't mean that we forget about the rest of the world, but it does mean that we have to pay some attention to how we work and how we live too.